Good evening. My name is Erin Vincent and I am the CEO of the Wheeler Centre, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to this special event. I'd like to acknowledge that we, the traditional owners of the unceded land on which we're gathered this evening, the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to elders past and present. I acknowledge the First Peoples of Australia as our first storytellers and creators of culture, and so much of that culture has been shared and celebrated here beside the beautiful Birrarung. I'd also like to acknowledge our venue partner, Fed Square, for this beautiful space, The Edge. Thank you, Fed Square. And I want to thank each of you for coming along to what's going to be an incredible and timely discussion about the threats and challenges to democracy around the world, one of the defining issues of our time. Tonight, you'll hear from the ABC's Global Affairs editor, John Lyons, who just last week was honoured as Journalist of the Year at the Kennedy Awards for his exceptional standard of reporting from the Middle East. John will be joined by public policy specialist Yuan Jiang, who has expert knowledge on Australia's relationship with China. And of course, our wonderful host this evening is Emma Shortis from the Australia Institute. Emma is the author of Our Exceptional Friend, Australia's Fatal Alliance with the United States. Sadly, you won't be hearing from Masha Gessen in person. As you may be aware, there have been a few twists and turns in the coming together of this event this evening. And I want you to know the Wheeler Centre worked tirelessly in an attempt to get them here in time for this event in person. Disappointingly, delays in the approval of their visa application impacted their travel schedule, which means they're currently making their way to Australia, and they'll be here just in time for their events at the Festival of Dangerous Ideas in Sydney this weekend. As a thank you for your patience while we've worked through these changes, we're very pleased to offer you complimentary access to the live stream of the Festival of Dangerous Ideas event, The War of the Narratives. You can simply register via the QR code, which is on the screen right there, and you'll receive the event in advance, access to the event in advance for this Saturday. Marsha was so sorry not to be able to join us here tonight in Melbourne, but they've recorded this special message while racing to the airport to share with you all. Would you please show your appreciation for Masha Gessen?
Could you explain to the audience, please, why we are recording this as opposed to you being in Australia in person, and why we're doing this in a car with our cat complaining?
Right, so apologies for doing this in the car. It's a little hectic because I only learned last night that I have my visa to go to Australia. And so I have to go through all these logistics to be able to fly on short notice, and we were just majorly delayed because our cat refused to get in the cat carrier and in fact hid from us. So we're harried. Apologies for doing this in the car. As some people in the audience probably know, my Australian visa was delayed. And the reason it was delayed is because I was convicted and sentenced in absentia by a Russian court for the crime that they call knowingly spreading false information about the Russian armed forces. In the rest of the world, what I was sentenced for is actually called journalism. I went to Ukraine and reported on Russian war crimes in Bucha. And then, after publishing an article about that in The New Yorker, I gave an interview to a Russian video blogger, a very, very popular one, because I felt it was important to speak to a Russian audience about this. And by speaking about Russian war crimes in Russian, I committed what Russian authorities consider to be a crime. Because immediately after the full-scale invasion, they passed a series of laws that outlawed talking about the war as a war and saying anything about the war that was not part of their official messaging. when I applied for my Australian visa, quite far in advance, I reported that I had been convicted. I attached a statement explaining what the nature of this conviction was. And then about a month later, the Australian authorities started demanding things like permission from Russia for me to travel, or proof that there was no impediment to my traveling. But of course, Russia has a warrant out for my arrest, so I couldn't possibly say that there was no impediment to my traveling. Anyway, to make a long story short, what I think is important about this is that the purpose of these kinds of sentences, and I'm by far not the only person who is living in exile but has been sentenced by Russians, and I'm one of about 250 people who've been charged under this particular law. So the purpose of sentencing people who are living in exile is to constrain them, to put us on notice, to make it clear to us that we're not free to move around the world or to say whatever we want to say, even though we're no longer living in Russia. And so for these warrants for people's arrest can be quite effective, not in getting them back to Russia, although that's happened, but in preventing people from traveling in the world, usually to countries that have extradition treaties with Russia, which are, to some extent, allies of Russia. That is obviously not true of Australia, but somehow the Australian authorities managed to put themselves in allyship with Russia by doing exactly what the Russian authorities would want them to do. And only after we raised awareness of this in the media did they finally come through with the visa, which is great news, but unfortunately it came too late for me to make it to Melbourne.
How do you feel international allyship affects local democracy? And how is it affecting the current state of American democracy?
And international allyship, you mean with other democracies or with, specify? And by the way, my fabulous interviewer here is my child, Yolka.
I mean with other democracies and non-democracies as well.
Well, I wish I could say more about allyship with other democracies, about the state of the U.S. democracy. Unfortunately, the United States is a uniquely self-centered country that, even when things that are very much part of worldwide trends, like the election of Donald Trump 8 years ago, even when that happens, the United States is always convinced that it's like the only place in the world that something like this has happened to. But of course, the alliance that comes to mind immediately that is affecting American policies is the American alliance with Israel, a country that is perpetrating genocide, and that, despite this, and in violation of U.S. laws, is benefiting from nearly unconditional U.S. support and an unprecedented, unequaled, anywhere in the world, amount of U.S. military aid that is making this genocide possible. And that alliance is having a huge influence on U.S. politics and may deservedly still cost the Democrats the election, which would be a terrible outcome for both the United States and, unfortunately, the people of Gaza, because a Trump presidency would be even worse, if you can imagine that, for the situation Israel-Palestine.
Thank you, and welcome everybody. I think we might have just found a new idea for a mini-series, Marsha Gessen talking in cars. But I'm sure I speak for everybody when I express our collective disappointment that Marsha wasn't able to be here with us tonight in person. And also, I think what I think is our collective shame at Australia's embarrassing and punitive immigration system, a system that certainly doesn't express the values of Australian democracy in the way that I think it should. But we are very fortunate to have such wonderful panellists here in real life with us tonight to discuss Marsha's opening comments, the future of democracy globally, and much more in the short time available to us. John, given Marsha's comments in that video and your own award-winning work covering the Middle East, I thought we might start with you. The relationship between Israel and the United States, as Marsha alluded to, is often framed as a relationship between two democracies. You know, it's very hard to get away from the somewhat tired trope of Israel as the only democracy in the Middle East. But that's a relationship that has very rightly been subject to significant criticism, like Marsha's. That there is, I think, a very credible suggestion that US President Joe Biden has been effectively done over by the Israeli PM Netanyahu, who is at the moment the real roadblock to a ceasefire in Gaza. So I wanted to ask you, given your extensive, really unique experience, how healthy is Israeli democracy really, and how important is that to understanding what Marsha described rightly as the Israeli government's genocidal campaign in Gaza?
Well, thank you, Emma, and thank you everybody for being here tonight. Israel is, in my view, and I lived there for 6 years, and I've been there 4 times since the October 7 atrocities by Hamas. It's a democracy plus. By that I mean it's a democracy with an occupation attached to it. And it's difficult to understand the Middle East and what's going on there if you don't have a concept of that occupation. In my view, many of the problems, and they're getting worse at the moment in the Middle East, we can talk about that a bit later, because we're on the brink of a possible regional war there at the moment. But a lot of the problems, in my view, come from Israel's insistence over decades that it continues to occupy the Palestinian people. And when I went there for the first time, I didn't really understand what occupation was. And there's not many countries in the world that continue with occupations because they're hard work. And what occupation means is that the Israeli army is the ultimate authority over the 3 million people in the West Bank. And this allows a lot of countries like Iran, whether they believe and want to support the Palestinians or not, and that's debatable, but it allows a lot of the Iranian proxies in the region, and we have a Four Corners program coming up this Monday night on it. I've just come back from Iran, Lebanon and Israel researching this particular story, but it allows that recruitment. And occupation means that if we, for example, were in the West Bank tonight, if this same discussion was happening in Bethlehem or Ramallah, the Israeli army could walk in here. If they didn't like the content, if they thought that one of the speakers was critical of Israel, they could simply walk in here and close the thing down. And occupation means, and one thing that really resonated with me, and I went over there fairly pro-Israeli to begin with, but the more I saw of this reality of the occupation, the harder it got. And I did a Four Corners called Stone Cold Justice a few years ago, where almost every night, and it will probably happen tonight, particularly in villages like Nabi Saleh, the Israeli army will come in, will knock on houses, will take away children, 12, 13, 14-year-old children. They'll take them, they won't be allowed to have a lawyer or a parent present. That child, the mother won't know where the child's gone to, and that child will end up on trial. I've sat in on some of those trials. Now, I explain this because unless you understand this burning anger amongst those 3 million Palestinians in Gaza and the 2.5 million in Gaza, you don't completely understand the reality. It's not for a moment to justify what Hamas did on October 7. I think that was, if it's my definition of a war crime. In terms of America's relationship, in my 4 visits over there since October 7, I've seen many times Antony Blinken or Joe Biden arriving in Jerusalem, and they have said to the Israelis, you are killing too many civilians, you have to stop. Joe Biden actually said that the bombing, Israel's bombing of Gaza, was indiscriminate. What he didn't add was that indiscriminate bombing of civilians fits the definition for many people of a war crime. He didn't add that all of the bombing has been mostly American bombs. And between October 7 and December 15, the Israelis dropped about 29,000 bombs on Gaza, which if you calculate that Gaza's 365 square kilometres, Gaza is half the size of Canberra. If you can imagine 29,000 bombs on half the size of Canberra, 79 bombs per square kilometre, that gives you a sense of the devastation. And the media's sort of lost a bit of interest in it now. It occasionally does a story about a ceasefire or not. But that's the reality of what's happening there right now.
Thank you, John. And I think, you've alluded to just the sheer difficulty of speaking that truth, of reporting that truth in such a fraught environment, even as you are reporting facts from the ground. Marsha spoke in their opening video about the difficulty of doing journalism today, about the persecution and prosecution of journalists worldwide. Now, their experience, of course, is with Russia, which has recently been in the news for persecuting American journalists who've just been returned there. But this treatment of journalists isn't just happening in what we might think of as, I guess, straight up autocracies. It's happening in Gaza, where Israeli forces deliberately target journalists. And as we are painfully aware in Australia, the United States also has a history of targeting journalists reporting the truth. They've just charged Australian citizen, Walkley award-winning journalist Julian Assange under the Espionage Act in an unprecedented move, and have set a globally deeply dangerous precedent for global attacks on the free press. So you've written a lot about your experience of doing journalism in the Middle East. It's partly the subject of your latest book, the second edition now of Dateline Jerusalem. Could you talk to us a little bit more about your own experience of doing journalism in this environment, and whether you think journalism is under attack worldwide?
Well, thanks, Emma. I have no evidence myself that Israel is deliberately targeting journalists, so I have to qualify that. What is fact, though, is that since the Gaza war began on October 7, about 130 Palestinian journalists have been killed, which is more journalists killed than during the Second World War. It's been absolutely devastating for Palestinian journalists. There are a lot of different dangers now facing journalists. I discovered a new one about 3 weeks ago when I was in Lebanon, and it's all to do with with the phone. The dangers now, I'm told, are digital. In fact, on our trip to Lebanon, we wanted to interview a leader of Hezbollah for the story about the possible regional war. And I was told by a very senior international security expert who's familiar with the area that he stressed to us, and this is a fairly new danger, none of you, there were 3 of us for the crew in the Four Corners team, and none of you should take any device, any phone, any iPad, any Apple Watch, anything that can be traceable. And I said to him, why is that? And he said, because now Israel, has basically an umbrella over Lebanon and Gaza, and they're looking at all of the communications. That's not necessarily a surprise, but this security expert said if the Israelis can see 3 foreign SIM cards in the Bekaa Valley, not many other people go there, foreigners go there at the moment, except journalists, they will assume that those 3 SIM cards are journalists, and they will want to interview someone from Hezbollah. So from the Israeli point of view, the advice was this will lead the Israelis to a Hezbollah target. And if those 3 SIM cards stop for long enough in a particular location, in the Bekaa Valley where we were, the Israelis may well hit that with a drone knowing that there's a chance they'll be killing a senior Hezbollah figure. And so that was a new risk that I had not realised. But it was similar, a different version of what happened with Murray Colvin, was the famous British journalist. Many of you would have known of her work. And she was in Syria. She had a satellite phone, and the Syrians did not like her or her reporting, and she was in a house with a couple of French journalists, and she turned on her satellite phone, and the Syrians, you don't very often get the signal of a satellite phone. They knew she was in that general area, and as soon as she turned on the satellite phone, they knew where she was, and then they hit that house with a missile and killed her. So it's one of the many dangers, but I can't compare the danger I've been in with the incredibly courageous journalists in Gaza who are trying to bring us the news.
Thank you, John. Yun, the Chinese government also, of course, has a somewhat troubled relationship with journalists and the free press. You are a renowned expert on China and Australia's relationship with China in particular, in which journalism and the free press has of course come up as well and had a direct impact on the relationship. Australian journalist Cheng Lai was only recently able to return home to Australia after a period of detention. And you too have direct experience of talking about China and writing about China in Australia, and that hasn't been easy for you. Could you talk to us a little bit about your experience and the role of journalism and also independent research in covering China, in speaking about China in Australia?
Wow, thank you. That's a lot of things to talk about in that question. So first, I guess I will first speak about what's happening inside China. So, of course, there is no freedom for press, freedom of press in China. I think everyone, even the Chinese government probably would agree with that statement. The press and journalists are heavily controlled and censored. So in a sense, because of that, you don't really get to hear the news of journalists being arrested for doing journalism, because they won't be doing that in the first place. So in terms of that, I guess what Masha has gone through, that just wouldn't happen. You will just get arrested for things. I think one of the charges they level at you is called picking quarrels and causing trouble. So that's like a cover-all. Anything you do against the government, you could be potentially get charged for that. In terms of, in the case of Chen Lei, it's actually quite unclear still exactly why she was detained and imprisoned. Of course, she was a journalist, but she was a journalist with the state media. And as far as we can see, she hasn't said anything controversial. She hasn't said anything, outright against the Chinese government. So I'm not sure if that's because of that she was arrested. So it's a bit unclear. And, because China being a very, I would say, a very opaque system, especially when it comes to the judicial system, no one, I guess, will never find out exactly why she was detained in the first place. Now, getting back to Australia. So I think one thing we need to think about that went through my mind when I was looking at that video was that, just because Russia charged dissidents for some crimes does not automatically necessarily flows that the Australian government needs to act on it, right? Because what happens outside, we should still have control of what's happening inside. So in terms of things like transnational oppression, so a lot of, from China, for example, there are a lot of dissidents that come from China. It is still up to the Australian government to protect those dissidents, and we can provide them with a safer environment and give them the freedom of speech that they want. So just because someone is charged outside does not necessarily absolve us of Australians, the responsibility of looking after them. But there is also, we do need to be a bit careful, though. There is a binary framing, especially when it comes to China, that often, especially under the Morrison government, someone, when we talk about China, usually it's either, okay, they're dissident, therefore they must be good, or, they are not saying anything bad about the government, therefore they must be supporting of the Chinese Communist Party. But that's not necessarily true. And one case was one of the dissidents that applied for asylum in Australia, and he was all over the news media, and I believe one of the MPs actually said he was a friend of democracy, and it turns out that he was actually lying. So just because someone was speaking out against autocracy does not necessarily mean they must be speaking the truth. And certainly in the United States, strangely, there is a very close relationship between the Chinese dissident community and Trump-supporting people. So it's not necessarily that they are supportive of liberal democratic values, but that they are against the Chinese Communist Party. So I think we need to be more nuanced, and we need to unpack people a bit more, and rather than see them as black and white. So I've been actually away from the China space for a while, and that's because when you talk about China, as a Chinese Australian, you always come under a lot of suspicion. I've been accused of many things, and that has taken a toll on my mental health. So this is actually my first public event this year. So the challenges of speaking in Australia, even though I am not a Chinese dissident, is that according to a research by UTS, about 40% of Australians believe that Chinese Australians can be mobilized by the Chinese government to undermine Australia. And that's really a worrying statistics. It's like saying, 40% say of Jewish people can be mobilized by Israel to undermine Australia. It's quite a shocking thing. And for me personally, I want to share a personal experience with you. This year, a journalist, Margaret Simons, reached out to me and told me that someone in the national security community told her that I was a target of an ASIC investigation, which actually is not so surprising because I was a public servant. I had security clearances. So it's not surprising, but the fact that someone will leak to a journalist just to discredit someone else for a political reason, and I think that's really concerning. And I would hope that this does not happen to anyone else. But I guess that's a price to pay. I mean, ultimately, came out to be fine because now I'm back in government. So clearly that had no adverse findings, but yeah, just because you live in a democracy does not mean that someone's not out to get you, I guess.
I guess so. Well, I think I speak for everyone when I say we're very glad that you're back speaking publicly, but also that your comments and Marsha's experience raise some pretty big red flags about Australian policy making. How is it that somebody in the Department of Home Affairs, which is an internationally oriented department, didn't see Marsha's application and think, oh, a Russian conviction, that's probably fine? Or, in your experience of being investigated in that sense, we do, as you say, kind of live in this binary framing for foreign policy. US President Biden has described the world in early on in his term as aligned between democracies and autocracies. You clearly, are complicating that narrative, but I want to ask you, kind of given your experience and your knowledge, whether democracies and autocracies can actually work together.
Actually, it's an easy question to answer in one respect. Can they work together? Well, of course they can, because they are working together. There is, I think Biden had a summer for democracy and invited the supposedly democratic countries. And there is a framing of there is China, which is an autocratic country. There's an axis of, it's no longer axis of evil, but there's a Russia and China, which are authoritarian countries. And then there is a US, which is supposed to be a democracy. And so that has elevated the US-China competition into a competition between democracy and authoritarianism. And that is the framing that they're going with. But, in fact, the United States, of course, is working with authoritarian countries. I wouldn't think anyone would call, for example, Saudi Arabia a democracy, I would hope. And of course, China working regularly with democracies as well. They work with any country in issues that aligns with their interests, and that is exactly what countries do, no matter whether they're democracies or not. I think there's also a narrative of, China is always against the violating the liberal rules of order. It's quite fascinating. I was thinking about when you were talking about Israel. I think before all this happened, China will always be criticized for undermining the liberal rules of order, which I agree. But ever since Trump got elected, and then more recently with what's happening in the Middle East, we don't hear that much anymore, because we know that it is our ally, our most important friend that's doing the violation. Then we don't want to talk about it. So there's a little bit of inconsistency there.
Just a little bit. I will remind you that there is an opportunity to ask questions if you like. If you scan the QR code up on the screen, you can submit your questions and upvote others, and we'll get to them shortly. But John, you mentioned the United States and its somewhat complicated role in the world and in upholding the international rules-based order. Marsha described the United States as a uniquely self-centred country, and there is quite a lot happening there at the moment. You've spent quite a bit of time covering the United States and its role in the world, and given that we're talking about the future of democracy, we can't not talk about American democracy. So I'm interested in how you assess the health of American democracy, even in spite of the pretty significant vibe shift around American democracy in the last couple of weeks. Risks remain. So how do you assess that health of American democracy?
Well, I think for many of us, when I grew up here in Melbourne, it was always the view at school and elsewhere that America was, the great democracy, the biggest democracy in the world, functioning well. And I think that the events of the storming of the Capitol, I think really showed a lot of people how fragile it is that the United States had a president, a commander-in-chief, a man who has the nuclear codes, Donald Trump, who wouldn't leave office. He was the kid who, it's my cricket set, and, if you say I'm out, then the game's over, I'm going home. And to see the most powerful man in the Western world doing that, to see those mobs storming the Capitol, and urged on by many people in America, including in the media, I think showed us that we can't really take anything for granted these days. We can't take, democracy for granted. And I think at the moment, I sometimes wonder if he were re-elected now, why would he happily leave in 4 years' time anyway if he wouldn't leave the first time? He almost had to be blasted out of office. So, and the fact that 45 or 50% of Americans appear to think that behaviour is acceptable, I think really makes us realise how fragile things are.
Yeah, it is an incredibly fraught situation. Marsha also mentioned, of course, the role that Gaza is playing and US support for Israel is playing in the elections. I wonder, what's your sense of how, if that issue may continue to influence not just the Democratic Party, but the electoral outcome in the United States as well?
Well, Masha made, an interesting point about the Democrats in America, and had Joe Biden remained as the candidate, it's possible that he would have been the first US president to lose office for being too pro-Israel, because there's certain big states like Michigan, which of course carries a lot of electoral college votes because it's so big, and it will be decisive. It's no coincidence that right now the Democrats are having their big campaign launch in Michigan because they need to win it. And Michigan, the Arab American community in Michigan is larger than the majority by which the Democrats hold the state. And many of them were saying, under Joe Biden, we will not turn up to vote on election day because we believe that you are complicit in what is going on in Gaza. And so even though, as Marcia said, even though that might have led to the election of Donald Trump, many of them have said, we don't care. We want to punish a president who has helped enable the dropping of thousands of bombs onto one of the most populated places on earth. And so we've never seen that in US politics before. Usually in America, a lot of the political elite think we need to be as pro-Israel as possible if we want to try to get into Congress, etc., because of the power of AIPAC. The Israeli lobby in America is very strong. I think the two strongest lobbies in America are the NRA, the National Rifle Association, and the Israeli lobby. And so you've got this incredible situation now where Kamala Harris may be able to wrest back Michigan. And it's no coincidence that when she met Benjamin Netanyahu 2 weeks ago when he was in America, and I've never seen an American leader do this publicly, but she looked him in the eye and said, enough is enough, stop. You are not going to continue what you're doing in Gaza. You're killing too many civilians, essentially, is what she said. And that surprised a lot of people. But the demographics, the political demographics are that although there is a significant Jewish American vote, it is mainly in safe states such as Florida, such as New York, such as California. These are not swing states, whereas the Arab American vote, who are very strongly supporting the Palestinians in Gaza, are in the swing states. And I think that has completely changed the dynamic.
It has, and really dramatically and really quickly. Thank you, John. Yun, of course, there are other international aspects to this election and to American democracy and significant stakes for Australia in that result. Not least because Australia's relationship with China is more often than not viewed through the lens of our relationship with the United States. So I wonder if you could speak a little bit about, how you see the future of Australia's relationship with the United States and, with China, and how US policy may or may not affect that.
Yeah, it is a little bit, I guess, unfortunate that our relationship with China is so reliant on US relationship with China. I'm sure you understand, our alliance with the US is almost seen as sacred in Canberra, and it's untouchable, no matter what. So to the extent, if the China-US relationship doesn't go so well, it is very difficult for Australia to improve our relationship with China. In terms of what the election means for their relationship, I think no matter what happens, the relationship between US and China is going to be difficult. Even under Biden, which to a lot of people and analysts in China is possibly Democrats will be perceived as possibly be better for the relationship, even under Biden with the with the technology sanctions, where they appears to be moving away from each other, and the fact that they're quite adversarial to each other, even under Democratic leadership, doesn't really bode well. And I'm sure they were expecting it to be even worse under Trump, even though They like to think that Trump is a business person, and a business person would like to do business with China. But I think most analysts would expect a worse outcome for the relationship. So I think no matter what happens, the baseline for Australia and China relationship probably wouldn't be too high. But I think, with the current government, we are moving towards a more nuanced approach, I would say. Certainly, since Labour came into power, compared to under the former government, we have been mending our relationship, and they were talking about stabilization. But it appears, we are always being on the process of stabilizing, but never getting there. So I think that's just a low ambition, and it appears a low ambition is all we are going for.
I think that's a very accurate description of Australian foreign policy generally. John, Yun mentioned that the relationship with China the US's relationship with China is an area of concern, especially kind of going into this election. Another relationship of concern now and into the future is that between the US and Iran. Now, you've just been in the Middle East reporting on the instability there, and there is a great deal of concern in the US and elsewhere about regional conflict. So I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about your recent experience there and how dangerous you think the broader regional context is.
Well, thanks, Emma. I've been either travelling to or writing about the Middle East now for 25 or even 30 years, and this is the most dangerous situation that I've seen in the Middle East. And having just spent, as Emma said, in Iran, Lebanon and Israel, where I've interviewed key senior people in all three places, and the reason that it is so dangerous right now, and I hope I'm wrong, but I fear that any morning we could wake up to the news that there is a new regional war. And what's happening right now is the supreme leader of Iran, Ayatollah Khamenei, is considering what response Iran and its major proxy, Hezbollah, which is essentially a frontline army for Iran on the border with Israel, he's considering what action they will take in response to two assassinations in the last 2 weeks, one which Israel admitted to and one which Israel did not admit directly to. The first one was the killing in Beirut of a man called Fuad Shukar, who was Hezbollah's senior military advisor, and the Israelis admitted that they assassinated him 2 weeks ago. But a more serious assassination in terms of the volatility of the region was the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh, the political leader of Hamas. Went to Iran as a guest of the government of Iran for the inauguration of the new president, and he was killed while he was there. Benjamin Netanyahu said afterwards, he didn't admit they'd done it, but he said, "We have dealt a crushing blow to Hamas," which in my view indicates that they may have done it, although they usually don't admit to those assassinations in other countries. Now, the reason it's significant is that from Iran's point of view, they feel humiliated that they had a guest here, had come there, and he was killed. And so they are now deciding, Hezbollah, which is mainly based in Lebanon, has about 150,000 missiles, which are in the south of Lebanon. Some of you may have been to Lebanon, but in the southern part, south of the Litani River, about 150,000 missiles that we know of. We talk about them in our Four Corners program on Monday. They have secret training camps, they have all sorts of things, and Iran can directly fly plane loads of weapons into Lebanon and Hezbollah controls the airport. The reason Hezbollah is an infinitely more formidable army than Hamas is. When you live in Israel for 6 years, Israelis often, the army talks about a war with Hamas as a bit of a training exercise. They have a phrase in Israel, some of the army people would say to me, when we have a war every 2 or 3 years in Hamas, in Gaza, we're cutting the grass, we're mowing the lawn. We're tending to the garden, just making sure we get rid of weeds. But they never talk that way about Hezbollah. In 2006, Israel had their last war with Hezbollah. It was a horrible war. No one won. If anything, Israel almost lost. They had a Winograd commission afterwards, their own commission, which essentially found that they'd done really badly. So my fear is that Iran will activate those missiles, and as good as Israel has its Iron Dome system, which can stop missiles, if Hezbollah decides, or if Iran decides Hezbollah will fire 10 or 20 or 30 or 40 missiles at once into Tel Aviv, then this is going to be horrible. And when I was in the Bekaa Valley, when I interviewed the Hamas official, he said to me, we can hit every square metre, every single city in Israel we can hit with our missiles. And then a week later, I was in Israel and I put that to a former head of Mossad, Zohar Palti, former head of intelligence in Mossad. I told him that the Hezbollah guy had said that. And I expected him to just say, what nonsense. He said, he's absolutely right. But before they get a chance to fire their 150,000 missiles, we will turn Beirut into a football court, was his exact quote. So hopefully, and to answer Emma's direct question, the US has no ability to calm this down. Part of the concern is that, in a way, China has now emerged. The Saudi Arabia and Iran last year, China brought the two of them together. America's standing in the Middle East now is rock bottom. Because of the Gaza war, very, very few people will allow America to be a mediator. So tonight, America has no ability to put a brake on this. China has much more ability to say to Iran, don't fire those missiles.
Yeah, which is an extraordinarily frightening situation, and I think doesn't bode well either for American democracy, given what we were talking about earlier, and how much stability in the Democratic Party will likely depend on a ceasefire that, as you've kind of outlined, is potentially at least a long way off, or a situation that may get a lot worse. I am conscious of time. It's a good time to remind you, I think, that John's book, if you want to hear more from John and learn more about his experience, is actually for sale. It will be for sale after the event up the back from Paperback Bookshop, and John has very kindly offered to sign copies, so I'd encourage you to buy one and hang around and get John to sign it for you. I will now go to questions from the audience, and we've got some hairy ones, actually. So I will go to the most popular one first in this excellent system, which I will throw open to either or both of you, depending on how you feel. Australians have been perceived as relatively politically apathetic compared to other democracies, so less engaged, I suppose, politically than in other democracies. What do you think are the causes of apathy in Australia, and how do we change it? Easy question.
Well, I think it's a hard question for me because I'm from Canberra. So I would even disagree with the sentiment that Australians are politically apathetic. But of course, I live in Canberra bubble, so perhaps I should not take my personal experience as the rule here. Why? Well, I think one thing we do well is that we do have a big turnout for our elections. And so I think because of people feel like they have a say in our elections, and compared to, for example, USA, we always compare ourselves to the USA. So I'll compare ourselves to the USA. USA have an election on a weekday. A lot of people, can't even get to the polling booth. So there's a lot of difficulties for them to have a say in the democratic system. Whereas I feel like we do give our citizens compared to the USA at least, a fair good say in our system already. So that this kind of a pressure valve is kind of acts like as a valve to release the pressure, so they don't have to feel like they need to express their political outrage in some other way. That's my take.
I actually think Australian democracy is in a much better shape than most places. I mean, all the countries I go to, you look at American democracy, talk about apathy there. And, you know, so I actually think that despite the problems, Australia's democracy is in pretty good health.
Yeah, I think it's certainly imperfect, our democracy, but I think relatively, you're right, we're doing pretty well. I have another question here that I think is probably for you, John. And the question is, do you think Marsha Gessen's pro-Palestinian stance could have contributed to their difficulties in accessing an Australian visa? I know that's a speculative question, so perhaps you could answer it in the context of your experience travelling the world and questions about your own coverage and how that's affected the work that you do or not.
Look, I don't know really the reason for it, but if it's either, you know, conspiratorial because of her pro-Palestinian views, or it's Canberra bureaucratic incompetence, I'll back the second one.
Yeah, unfortunately, I think you might be right. Another question, we're very much on this theme of the health of democracy. What do you think poses the biggest threat to democracy, not just in Australia, but globally? Is it attacks on the free press? Is it, there's a whole list here, the role of big tech, which we haven't even covered in a democracy, or things like behind-the-scenes lobbyists. So there are a number of threats, of course, to democracy around the world. What do you think is the biggest one?
I think a few come to my mind. One is trust in government. I think there's a declining trust in government in a lot of democracies. I am not able to pinpoint the exact reasons why there is such a declining trust, but I think that's a really big challenge. And the second thing that came to my head, even before you said the role of a digital platform, I do think that perhaps it's not technology's fault, but the fact that when you go onto social media and you only see things that basically the social media platforms think that you are engaged with, so either you really love it or you really hate it. So for example, they would push contents to you that they know you absolutely hate, so that you engage with them more. And that, I believe, does lead to problems of polarization in politics. And I think that is another challenge to democracy.
I think the biggest threat to democracy is attacks on institutions. I mean, for example, in Israel, it's no coincidence that for the year before the Gaza war, there were hundreds of thousands of Israelis protesting because Benjamin Netanyahu wanted to remove the independence of the Supreme Court so that the parliament, his party, the Likud party, could override the Supreme Court. It's no coincidence in America that the biggest battle that the Democrats and Republicans often have is control of the Supreme Court. So I think it's these institutions, and I think in Australia we're lucky that we have an independent judiciary. We have independent courts. Our media, an organisation like the ABC is important because despite whatever problems or faults it might have, it is still an organisation that can produce journalism that's independent of the government or of any political party or commercial interests. And I think these institutions are important. When you start to lose these sorts of institutions, then it means that people, you know, the autocrats can start to move in.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit more about the role of the media as an institution in a democracy, because we've got a question here I was so proud of myself for getting through the whole event without talking about Donald Trump, but of course we can't escape him. We're going to have to do it because we've got a question from the audience about it. The questioner has noted that opposition leader Peter some of his recent comments are decidedly Trumpian, in his calls to ban Palestinians from Australia, to deny them visas. In some of his other comments about wokeism in Australia, he's kind of evoking a sort of Trumpian politics. And this questioner asks what the media has learned about covering Donald Trump and covering kind of extremism and conspiracy in politics that can be applied in Australia going forward. Nobody wants to talk about Trump.
I think that what we always learn from any of these is that get back to basic principles of journalism. And I started here as an 18-year-old at the old Melbourne Herald. Many of you would remember the afternoon paper in those days. And the basic principles I learnt as an 18-year-old were who, what, when, where, why. And I think whether it's covering the Israeli-Palestinian conflicts or Donald Trump or Anthony Albanese or Peter Dutton, it's important to try to give the public, to give you the facts and the information. I think that one of the problems with media, I think these days, including in Australia, is too many journalists are wanting to just give their opinion all the time. Often you'll read a newspaper or hear someone on TV and they're arguing strongly one side or the other. And I think that what we really lack is just old-fashioned journalism, and it's sort of gone a bit out of favour now. And I think that the best way to counter any people, any politician, any lobby group is just try to dig in and report the facts. And I think that it's much easier often for a journalist to give their opinion. And what I try to do with the Israeli-Palestinian thing is research it so much and not say something unless I know it for sure and have double-checked and triple-checked. And I think that we have to just get back to being fact-based as journalists.
Now, I'm not a journalist, but I just realized I haven't answered your previous questions about independent research, and you raise a very important point. When we do research, and including on foreign policy, but also on any policy issues, we should be guided by our research, by evidence. But unfortunately, I believe too often we start off with a conclusion and then we find supporting evidence for it instead.
Yeah, I think that's such an important point. We are right on 8 o'clock, so I will remind you that John's book is for sale up the back, and then thank my panellists, John Lyons and Yun Jiang, for an absolutely wonderful conversation about the state of democracy globally and Australia, the stakes for Australia in that, a conversation that I'm sure will continue, especially in the lead up to November in the United States. So please join me in thanking John and Yun.